Ambassador at Large Nathan Sales was a coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department from 2017 to 2021. He also served at the same time as acting Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. In his role at the State Department, Ambassador Sales was the architect of the landmark 2017 UN Security Council Resolution 2396 on terrorist travel and sanctions, and he successfully pressed NATO to make counterterrorism a core alliance mission. He also had diplomatic engagements to persuade a dozen key partners in Europe and the United States to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. Ambassador Sales is recognized globally as a leader on counterterrorism, sanctions, and human rights. He will share with us today his experience in the Capital TV show from the University Club here in Washington, D.C. Former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism, Nathan Sales, you are most welcome in the Capital TV show. Let me start talking about Afghanistan. What is your strategic assessment of the way Biden administration handled the United States military withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, it's not good. The top priority right now has to be getting every American citizen out. We're hearing reports of anywhere from 10,000 to 15,000 American citizens who are either in Kabul, close to the airport, or spread throughout the country. Our number one priority has to be any American who wants to come home has to be able to come home. And the second thing we have to do is make sure that we're able to get our Afghan partners out. There's up to 80,000 Afghan applicants for special immigrant visas here in the United States. These are people who believe in America, who trusted America, and now America has to make sure that we're going to protect them by bringing them out of harm's way.
Why this chaos happened?
I think there are a couple explanations for this. The White House, reading between the lines, the military was given very constraining resources, very limited resources that limited their ability to operate effectively on the ground. Now, the military is not going to say that publicly. They're good soldiers. They're going to carry out their orders. But reading between the lines, it seems as though the White House made political decisions that we were not going to have a certain number of resources on the ground, a certain number of troops on the ground. So, for example, the worst decision that the Biden administration made was to surrender control of Bagram Air Base. It's a facility about 25 to 30 miles north of Kabul. It is easily defended. It was a facility from which you ideally would want to conduct a massive airlift of vulnerable people out. But we turned that over to the Afghan army, and it's now in the Taliban's hands. When our military professionals were asked, why did you give up control of Bagram? They said basically we didn't have enough troops. We had to choose, are we going to keep troops around our embassy to protect our diplomats, or are we going to protect and maintain custody of Bagram Air Base? They simply didn't have enough resources to do both. And that's not the military's fault. That's the White House's fault.
Why do you think that Biden couldn't stop Taliban for taking over Afghanistan?
So there's a couple of problems here. I think the most important point to emphasize is that we didn't have to leave. Nobody in America wants 100,000 American troops on the ground in Afghanistan. The era of massive American boots on the ground deployments is over. But what we could have done was keep about 2,500 American counterterrorism experts on the ground. That would have done a couple of things. One, it would allow NATO to continue to operate there. There were about 8,500 NATO allied forces serving alongside the United States. They can't operate unless the United States is there. So if we stay with a very small footprint, we enable NATO to stay there. We also, if we keep a small footprint, are in a position to do counterterrorism strikes on Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other terrorists in the country. It's much harder to do that if we don't have boots on the ground. And then the third thing that we could have done if we had kept a very small force on the ground in Afghanistan was enable operations by the Afghan army. The Afghan armed forces were entirely dependent on the United States for close air support. We trained them for 20 years to fight alongside the American Air Force and the American Navy. The minute we took those resources away, morale collapsed, and they found themselves, the Afghan allies, found themselves in a fight that they had never trained for. All we needed to do was keep about 2,500 soldiers on the ground to continue to train them and advise them and to support them on the front lines of combat. Unfortunately, the White House didn't take that advice.
Do you predict the failure of Taliban in Afghanistan? I want to just quote what Trump said. He said it was wrong to get into wars in the Middle East. How can better change happen in Afghanistan, considering the disastrous policies of the Obama-Biden administration there?
Well, is the Taliban going to succeed? No. The Taliban will never succeed in Afghanistan. They will never have the legitimacy that comes from the support of the Afghan people. We're seeing heartbreaking and dramatic images of the Afghan people voting with their feet. They know what a return to Taliban rule means for them. It means the destruction of human rights. It means the destruction of democracy. It means the destruction of opportunities for women and girls. And every Afghan who can is looking for a way to escape the coming brutality of Taliban rule. The Taliban will never have the support of the Afghan people. I think
in CNN yesterday they talked about Taliban moderate and Taliban conservatives. Are they many groups or many mentalities in Taliban thinking, or it's the same? It's terrorist. It's a terrorist group.
I don't think it's helpful to use terms like moderate versus conservative within the Taliban, because that's a form of what intelligence professionals call mirror imaging, assuming that an adversary has the same makeup and priorities as we do. And I think that's simply not the case. Now, the Taliban is a complex organization. There are different elements within it, but I don't think it's really useful to describe some of those as being more moderate or more hardline than the others. They're all committed fundamentally to the same thing. They all want the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Afghanistan. They all believe in using military force and violence to achieve their malign objectives. They all want to return women and girls to the dark ages. There's nothing moderate about any of that.
Exactly. Senior Senate Republican said that Biden opened the door to attacks against us, more attacks. Do you predict the reviving of Al-Qaeda in maybe a few months?
I think the Taliban's conquest of Afghanistan is the best news that Al-Qaeda has had in decades. They have had a hand-in-hand relationship for 20 years. The Taliban has never broken with Al-Qaeda. They didn't break with Al-Qaeda at Tora Bora. They didn't break with Al-Qaeda during the Obama administration surge. They're certainly not going to do it now when they see the Taliban's strategy as propelling them to victory. And so the real concern here is that the Taliban is going to allow Afghanistan to become another safe haven for Al-Qaeda, give them the space they need to redevelop their networks. And when that happens, Al-Qaeda is going to start targeting the homeland for terrorist attacks.
Will there be Iranian influence in Kabul?
It's hard to say for certain, but it's a safe assumption that the answer will be yes. Any place there is violence and bloodshed in the Middle East, look for Iran to be playing an active role. Iran will not be a force for stability and prosperity and human rights in Afghanistan. Iran will simply cause further instability and further violence, just as they have in Yemen, just as they have in Lebanon, just as they have in Syria and Iraq. The track record for Iranian involvement in the Middle East is not a happy one.
Do you expect success for the negotiation going in Vienna between USA and Iran over the nuclear program?
Well, I guess that depends on what you mean by success. I think the Biden administration was given a very strong hand by the outgoing Trump administration. We had crippling economic sanctions on Iran that had devastated their ability to sell oil, that had devastated their ability to finance terrorism around the world. Now, they're still doing it. That's built into the very nature of the Iranian regime. But the crippling sanctions under maximum pressure had dramatically lowered their financial reserves. I think I saw the other day that their foreign currency reserves had dropped from more than $120 billion down to $4 billion. So the Biden administration inherited a hand of cards that was stacked against the Iranians. Unfortunately, the Iranians can see what is plain for everyone to see. see, which is that the Biden administration is so desperate to get back into a deal that they're willing to squander that leverage. Now, a good deal has to include more than just temporary limits on the Iranian regime's nuclear program. What a good deal looks like is one that controls their ballistic missile program, their support for terrorists and other proxies across the region. The regime has said those are off the table. And so I worry that a future nuclear deal with Iran is going to trade massive sanctions relief in exchange for temporary limits on the Iranian nuclear program, and we will have squandered our leverage to address the other malign behavior of Tehran.
Have you been following the latest news on Al-Ahwazi protest, and what do you think about its future?
I think it shows that the Iranian regime has no legitimacy whatsoever with the Iranian people. I think the Iranian people are tired of the corruption and priorities of the regime. The Iranian people want democracy, they want freedom, they want education, they want basic social services like water. And you know, it's not just because of a drought, it's not just because of climate change that the water situation in Iran is so dire. It's because the IRGC has been using corrupt public works projects to line their own pockets. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been lining its own pockets with the people's money and then using that to support terrorist proxies around the world. I think the Iranian people are saying that's enough and we demand accountability. And so in a situation like that, I think it is incumbent on the United States to always stand on the side of protesters who are calling for democracy and human rights. I think that's exactly what the Biden administration should be doing in Iran right now.
Your Excellency, you are the former Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy and Human Rights. What do you think about kidnapping and the arrests that Iran's mullah intelligence are doing against people, innocent people like activists or teachers who teach Kurdish? So do you think that the Biden administration, in terms of human rights in Iran?
The Biden administration has said that they want to put human rights at the center of our foreign policy, and I think Iran is the right place to start. The Iranian regime has systematically violated the rights of its citizens for years, for decades, and the kidnappings that we see at home and abroad are just part of the way the regime operates. Here in the United States, we saw a recent case in which a prominent Iranian-American journalist was going to be kidnapped on the streets of Brooklyn, New York. Now, think about that. Tehran is trying to kidnap an American citizen on American soil. That's the kind of malign behavior that typifies this regime and that demands a very tough response from the United States. Now, the Justice Department is certainly going to prosecute the individual perpetrators who were responsible for this plot, but it's important to keep in mind they weren't acting in a vacuum. They were doing this because they were ordered to do this by the Iranian regime. And so it's essential that we also hold the regime itself accountable. One way to start is to stop the nuclear talks. We are not going to sit down at a table in Vienna with people who are actively plotting to kidnap our citizens on our own territory.
Good point. You had diplomatic engagements to persuade a dozen key partners in Europe and the Americas to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. What is the future of Hezbollah in Lebanon while we are witnessing a chaos in this country?
Well, Hezbollah has spent the last 20 years or more impoverishing Lebanon and engaging in corruption that has brought a great country to the point of catastrophe and crisis. Lebanon deserves better than Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a force for instability. It is a force for violence. It is not the defender of Lebanon as it sometimes portrays itself. I just saw the other day reports that Hezbollah had stored munitions at a school. Now think about that. This is an organization that is taking children hostage and using them as human shields. That is not an organization that has the best interests of the Lebanese people at heart. The United States recognizes Hezbollah for what it is. It's a terrorist organization, full stop. And that is why for many years we have treated the group in its entirety as a terrorist organization. We don't buy that there's a distinction between a so-called political wing that you can do business with and the so-called militant wing. It's all militant. And by the way, we're not the only ones who say that. Hassan Nasrallah says that as well. There's one resistance, as he calls it. And so the United States has been working very hard to persuade other countries to join us in designating Hezbollah in its entirety. And it's great to see that in the past 4 years, more than a dozen countries in Europe and in the Americas have followed the United States lead. Countries like Germany and the United Kingdom and many others. Our hope is that other countries will join this emerging international consensus, including the European Union, which currently has only designated Hezbollah's so-called military wing. It's time to call it for what it is. It's time to designate the whole group.
Do you predict a war between Hezbollah and Israel late this summer? We are seeing lots of maybe confrontation recently.
It's difficult to say. I think the long-term view of the United States is that it is not in the interest of Israel and not in the interest of Hezbollah to fight another war right now. But look, the Middle East is a tinderbox, and it's impossible to predict what spark is going to set it off. I think it's important, if a conflict does arise, for the United States to be very clear that Israel has a right to defend itself, and that any damage that is done to Lebanon because Hezbollah initiates a conflict is squarely the responsibility of Hezbollah. I think the international community must signal to Hezbollah very clearly that we will hold you responsible for any damage that befalls the innocent people of Lebanon.
On the other side, the United Arab Emirates is an important diplomatic power in the Middle East. How can it contribute more to fight religious extremism found in the political activity of a group such as Muslim Brotherhood?
I think one of the most important diplomatic achievements we've seen in the past 3 or 4 or 5 decades even was the Abraham Accords, which were negotiated during the last year of the Trump administration, in which a number of Arabic and Middle Eastern countries decided to normalize relationships with Israel. Now, I think that's good not just for the countries that are part of those agreements. I think it's good for the region as a whole, because the more peace agreements that we can get into place, the more stability we will have, the more economic development we will have, the more person-to-person contacts we will have. And all of those developments start to build deep and fundamental foundations for a long and durable peace. The United Arab Emirates was one of the first countries to sign on to these deals with Israel, along with Morocco, along with Sudan, along with Bahrain. And we're hopeful, the United States is hopeful, that we'll see other countries continue in that trend.
Do you think, or do you rank the United Arab Emirates as a model in the Middle East?
I think the UAE has some very important resources, and I'm not just talking about money, I'm talking about ideologically. This is a country that has been committed to a pluralistic and tolerant version of Islam. Now, they're not the only ones who have this understanding of Islam. Many others around the world, around the region do too. But the UAE really has been at the forefront of promoting an understanding of Islam that is perfectly compatible with Western-style democratic ideals, that is perfectly compatible with human rights, and that values pluralism and diversity among people of the other Abrahamic faiths and people of no faith. I think it's very important to hear these voices in the Middle East and in the Arabic world and in the Muslim world calling for pluralism and tolerance and religious diversity and religious fellowship. I think that is the future of the region, and that is a future that will be prosperous and peaceful and dynamic.
Has the Biden administration been firm in stopping the Houthis' attacks against Saudi Arabia and sabotaging their country?
The Iranian regime has been grossly irresponsible in providing their proxies in Yemen, the Houthi rebels, with sophisticated weapons, including drones. The Houthis have been using these weapons to target civilian infrastructure across the Arabian Peninsula, including oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, airports there and in the United Arab Emirates. They actually attempted a decapitation strike on the Yemeni government as it landed at an airport in Yemen about 6 months ago. Fortunately, they missed their intended target, but they did manage to kill a number of innocent bystanders, including a number of humanitarian workers. None of this is possible without the lavish support from Tehran. And so it becomes absolutely critical for the United States to use whatever leverage we can over the Houthis and over their patrons in Tehran to cease and desist. Now, in the Trump administration, we designated the Houthis as a terrorist organization. We called a spade a spade. If you're launching missiles at civilians, that sounds like terrorism to us. Unfortunately, in one of its first acts in office, the Biden administration rolled that back. And unfortunately, I don't see that that has gotten us any closer to the diplomatic solution to the conflict in Yemen that the United States has been pursuing with our European and Gulf partners for a long time.
You were in charge of counterterrorism in the State Department. Can you please explain more on the operations that Saudi Arabia is involved in to combat terrorism?
Well, I think the Saudis have been an increasingly important partner of the United States, particularly when it comes to countering extremism. You know, for many years, Saudi textbooks and Saudi schools were not ideal environments for promoting pluralism and tolerance, to put it mildly. There were some pretty terrible, officially sanctioned lessons that encouraged violence and hatred and animosity to people who shared different ideological outlooks and different religious faiths. We've been working with the Saudis for many years to try and promote a more pluralistic and tolerant and open version of Islam. The Saudis have been making some important steps towards that, but I think there's still some work that needs to be done there.
My final question, how do you evaluate the counterterrorism strategy for the Biden administration?
I think when it comes to counterterrorism, the first principle is do no harm. Make the environment no worse than it is right now. And I have to say, I worry that with the situation in Afghanistan and with the negotiations with Iran, the Biden administration is not using every piece of leverage and every instrument of national power to diminish the terrorist threat. I fear that the terrorist threats could grow more severe on their watch. If we sign a deal with the regime in Tehran and provide them with sanctions relief, those dollars are going to find their way into the hands of groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis, to the IRGC, and these groups are going to be propagating bloodshed around the region, around the world. I worry that with the Taliban now taking control of Afghanistan, that will create safe haven for groups like Al-Qaeda to plot attacks in the region and indeed on the United States. So I think the most important thing that the Biden administration can do when it comes to counterterrorism is keep up the good work that administrations of the past 20 years have lined up behind. Not just Republicans, not just Democrats. There's been a bipartisan consensus on the need to use all instruments of national power to confront terrorist threats there before they reach our shores here. I hope that the Biden administration will learn from their predecessors and continue to make this a priority.
Former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism, Nathan Sales, you are most welcome in the Capital TV show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.